In recent years, it has become common practice for studios to restart movie series and reinvigorate them with a clean slate. This has led to the popularization of the term reboot, but the definition has become strangely blurred, and I now see it applied to films and even television shows that don't fit into the traditional meaning of the term. So I wanted to explain and set the record straight for what is a reboot, or a sequel, or even a remake in some cases. Now the first question is, when did the term reboot originate in the Hollywood lexicon? The popularity of the term reboot can primarily be traced back to Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. Until that film, most franchises tended to continue where previous films had left off. Even if you switched actors, like what happened with James Bond, the events of previous films would still be acknowledged as part of the canon. Batman himself switched lead actors a few times throughout the 90s, but the likes of Batman Forever and Batman and Robin were still seen as direct sequels, even with Joel Schumacher's approach to Gotham City being somewhat different from Tim Burton's. When Warner Brothers decided to give the Batman movies another go in the new millennium, they wanted audiences to forget about Batman and Robin. WB and the filmmakers openly mentioned this was a reboot. They were completely starting over, ignoring all the previous Batman films and existing in its own universe. This also gave Nolan the freedom to shape that world in the way he saw fit, without being weighed down by what Burton and Schumacher had done before him. Following the success of Batman Begins, the producers of the James Bond series decided to take a similar approach. Those movies always existed on a sliding timeline, frequently mentioning past events and enemies, even when 007 went from Sean Connery to Roger Moore to Pierce Brosnan. Starting with Casino Royale, the filmmakers decided to show Bond in a different light, taking him away from the somewhat campy tone that had developed. They wanted Daniel Craig's debut appearance to act as an origin story, and to do that, they would have to erase all the previous Bond missions. Judi Dench did reprise her role as M, although the depiction of the character was slightly tweaked, and it's recognized this is a different M than the one in the Brosnan films. Sony famously decided to take the reboot approach with The Amazing Spider-Man, after not pursuing a fourth Spider-Man movie with Sam Raimi, and told Peter Parker's origin story all over again. And then, of course, rebooted the web crawler again with Spider-Man Homecoming. We're also about to see the X-Men rebooted once they make their initial appearances in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So the definition of reboot seems pretty simple, doesn't it? A whole new continuity that ignores all previous iterations and starts a new timeline again from scratch. Well, nowadays a common misconception is that any reinvigorated series is a reboot, or the strange term soft reboot. And that's not correct. For example, 2015's Vacation was often called a reboot, due to the new leads and returning to a long dormant series. However, Vacation directly mentions events from the previous films. Chevy Chase and Beverly D'Angelo reprise their roles as the Griswold patriarchs, and the entire plot of the movie centers on a grown-up Rusty Griswold trying to visit the Wally World theme park again. There's also a scene where we see Rusty look through old family photos taken from the previous films, and the movie even continues the tradition of having new actors play Rusty and Audrey. Jurassic World has also been referred to as a reboot, despite characters directly referencing the events of the Jurassic Park movies, and we even see characters visit the site of the original park from the 1993 blockbuster, complete with recycled props. The most perplexing case of a sequel being incorrectly labeled a reboot by some is Star Wars The Force Awakens. I have honestly seen this and it leaves me scratching my head, especially since the movie begins with Episode 7 appearing in giant letters during the opening scroll. If a movie acknowledges the events of earlier films, it's a sequel, not a reboot. Of course, this then leads to the question of what happens when a movie decides to ignore certain entries in a franchise, while leaving others intact. Superman Returns, for instance, takes place after the events of Superman 2 and completely ignores Superman 3 and 4. I still consider that a sequel. The series is just now split off into a new timeline. Think almost that scene in Back to the Future Part 2, where Doc Brown explains the alternate Hill Valley realities. Last year's Halloween also took that approach, by making it a follow-up to the original film and ignoring all the sequels that came afterwards. That's not even the first time one of the films has done this, as 1998's Halloween H2O similarly removed several of the sequels from the Michael Myers timeline. That's not even getting into the strangeness of Halloween 3, and then there's Rob Zombie's Halloween, which is a remake rather than a reboot and which got a sequel of its own. Yeah, Halloween requires a lot of grabs to be able to make sense of it all. This reboot sequel problem is not just restricted to movies. When a television show is brought back for more seasons with the original cast several years later, this is called a revival. But a lot of reviewers and trade publications call this a reboot. When Roseanne returned to airwaves last year, it was not called a new series. It was considered the 10th season. Same goes for the recent revivals of Will and Grace and Murphy Brown. The new Charmed series, on the other hand, is a reboot of the original show, as is the new She-Ra cartoon currently streaming on Netflix. Now, there are times when I understand people's confusion over whether something is a reboot. From the advertising, it seemed like Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle, would not have much to do with the 1995 Joe Johnston film. Aside from a quick glance at the infamous board game, it did not seem like it had that much of a connection with Jumanji. However, the movie turned out to be a sequel in the end, as it even brings up Alan Parrish's time stuck in the Jumanji world. When I saw the trailer for the new Charlie's Angels movie, I assumed it was a complete reboot. Upon doing a bit of research, I found out it's actually a sequel to the early 2000s Charlie's Angels films and the television series. It will be interesting to see how clear the finished film will make this revelation. There's also the curious case of J.J. Abrams' Star Trek. That film is unique among entries of movie franchises, as it functions as a sequel, prequel, and reboot. It's a sequel due to Leonard Nimoy's original Spock arriving from the future with knowledge of the prior films and television show episodes. In Star Trek Into Darkness, Spock even refers to the events of the Wrath of Khan. It's a prequel as it takes place before the original series and the movies. And it's a reboot because the time-traveling Romulans affect the timeline and thus the original events after Jim Kirk's birth never happened. That was quite the clever device, as it allowed Abrams to both respect the continuity fans have become attached to, while also giving himself the freedom to shape the Enterprise crew's adventures and personalities as he so pleased. Oddly enough, it's not only sequels that are erroneously called reboots. New versions of public domain properties are often called reboots, like last year's Robin Hood movie. Oh, didn't you know? Apparently the rights were expiring on this 700-year-old legend. I also frequently see remakes referred to as reboots, even though remake is specifically a story that has been retold again. The current crop of Disney remakes have occasionally been called reboots by the press, including the new Lion King that just opened. This despite the fact several of them use the same story templates and songs from the original animated films. That the term is so loosely thrown around these days has led to reboot losing all meaning, and I feel if we're not going to use it properly, we should just remove it entirely from our vocabulary. New terms are even being invented just to justify the continued misuse of reboot. One that really annoys me is legacy sequel. I've seen these called reboots, even though the definition given is it's a film that's set in the same universe as the prior films and uses the characters played by the same actors, but the excuse given is that they're made for a new generation. That is still not a reboot, that is a sequel. Can we please stop making up ridiculous buzzwords? So I'm going to explain it one more time. A movie that acknowledges the events of the previous films and continues where they left off in the series is a sequel. A movie that completely restarts everything from scratch and ignores all other entries in a franchise is a reboot. A movie that just retells the same story from an earlier film yet again is a remake. And when someone takes a source material like a book or a play or even a newspaper article and translates it into a film, it's an adaptation. I hope that all makes sense. Please tell me it made sense, and I'll see you next time.